Well, let me just ask you, and I'm not necessarily expecting a show of hands, but how many of you all have lived through seasons of just tremendous pain? Something that was just way more than you expected. Maybe it was a season of betrayal. That's kind of where I want to zero in right now. It's just on my mind because of the scriptures we're going to be looking at today. But if you've been betrayed, it really, really stings, doesn't it? Maybe, for example, maybe you were promised the promotion, right? You were told, oh yeah, it's yours, it's coming to you. Hang on. Wait another day, another week, another month, another year, and that promotion will belong to you. And then it didn't happen. That kind of betrayal hurts, doesn't it? Maybe you were betrayed by a friend. You went to them with something that was heavy on your heart, man. And you shared it with them, and you expected it to stay in confidence, but it didn't. It got everywhere. And you're dealing with the fallout of that betrayal. Maybe you thought your boyfriend was the one, and you began to really give your heart away. And then he found one he liked better. You got dumped. That betrayal hurts, doesn't it? Or maybe the stakes are even higher. Maybe it's your spouse, and you see your marriage just unspiraling in front of you, and maybe betrayal is at the root of it. And you're thinking, man, I don't deserve this. Some of us, maybe you have that kind of history with pain or betrayal in your life. Some of you may be going through that kind of betrayal and pain right now. And it can be really, truly overwhelming, can't it? As you think about betrayal, let me ask you, what was God up to in the midst of that betrayal? What was He doing? After all, God Himself is no stranger to betrayal. He understands it. It's all over the Bible. I mean, and it happens right at the very beginning. God creates Adam and Eve, places them in the Garden of Eden, tells them, hey man, this is all for you. There's only one thing that you should not do. What happens? Betrayal. They stabbed Him in the back, did it anyway. Fast forward to Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus builds around Him a team of 12 disciples that He trusts. One of them, Judas, a man that He trusted, what did he do? He betrayed Jesus, didn't he? So all over the Scripture, you just see the reality of betrayal. God understands the pain of betrayal. And if you're like me, betrayal is very personal. It's very hard to overcome. It's the kind of pain that you can carry for days, for weeks, for months, even years. And if we don't find a way to move on from betrayal, if we don't find a way to get out from under the weight of it, that betrayal can absolutely derail you. Let me just ask you, how many of you all have ever lost sleep because of pain that was caused to you by somebody else? Just raise your hand. Man, I have. I've had a lot of sleepless nights over it. How many of you all have had your stomach just tied in knots because someone caused you pain? Right? It's a very real thing. If you've got a history of pain, and if you don't deal with it correctly, it can absolutely end you. So let me ask you right now, if you are in pain from a betrayal or some other old wound, regardless of the origin, I just want to invite you to pay attention today. Because I believe that we've got a real lesson to learn about how we deal with pain. And Joseph, the person that we're going to zoom in on, puts on an absolute masterclass on how to overcome pain and betrayal. When it comes to pain and betrayal, Joseph was an absolute expert. Tommy preached last weekend. I let him have that message because I knew that if we were going to cover the entire, basically, life of Joseph in one sermon, Tommy would do it better than anybody. And he just crushed it. The whole thing with the robes and all that stuff. What a great touch. He did a really, really good job. And if you missed it, I would encourage you to go back and see the video. It was really, really well done. I want to just give him a lot of credit for that. But this morning, I just want to give you a real quick recap so that we can kind of understand where we're going here. Joseph was born to a man named Jacob. He was the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. Genesis 37 says straight up that Joseph was loved by Jacob more than his other sons. I mean, it's just right there. Boom. Now, I read a study the other day that said that most parents do have favorites. Mom and dads, pay attention. Who do you think the favorites typically are in the family? Everybody assumes it's the baby, right? That is not true. It is not the baby in the family. Who is the favorite usually in the family? The oldest, and this one was a little bit of a surprise, the daughter. So if you're the youngest son, you lose. And I want you all to know, full disclosure, I'm the baby in my family. I lost, man. I was not the favorite child. Anyway, this is about Joseph, so let's come back to him. Let's not pick that wound, okay? Joseph was clearly the favorite of his dad, Jacob. And Jacob demonstrates this by giving Joseph a special gift. What was the gift? You might know? The coat. The coat of what? The coat of many colors. Oh, yeah. You guys grew up in Vacation Bible School too, didn't you? That's what Joseph got. My brother got a motorcycle. Did I get a motorcycle? No, I did not. Who was the favorite? Okay, this is about Joseph. Let me just move on from that, okay? So anyway, Joseph receives this incredible fancy coat, and it's not just a coat. It wasn't just the fact that he got a nice outfit kind of thing. The problem was what the coat represented. It was a symbol of that favoritism. Now, Joseph reveled in his status as the favorite. And one day, I assume while he's wearing this fancy coat, he tells his brothers about a dream that he has. And in the dream, he envisions all of his brothers one day bowing down before him. Now, let me just give you a safety tip for the future. If you ever dream that your whole family will come and bow down to you, keep it to yourself. Don't go tell them. But Joseph goes and he tells them. And so his brothers respond both to the coat and to the dream by hating Joseph. And they hate him more and more and more. This is an escalating thing. They don't go and say, okay, I've got to deal with my rage appropriately. They don't have that conversation. Now, did God cause their rage? No. That was their own sinfulness speaking. And sooner or later, as that rage continues to build, they make the decision to act on that rage. They see Joseph coming to them in the field. He was wearing that fancy coat. And as he drew near, they cooked up a plan. They said, we're going to kill him. They checked down from that plan and decided instead to just sell him into slavery, because that's a lot better. They threw him into a pit, and sure enough, they sold him into slavery. Can we agree that you all, that's hatred and betrayal? Can we agree? That's what that is. Joseph is taken to Egypt and bought by a man named Potiphar. Potiphar is an officer in the Egyptian government. He is working for Pharaoh. And Joseph manages to go on and thrive in spite of the betrayal. It's not long after he arrives at Potiphar's house before he is placed in charge of the entire household. His skill set, his integrity, they are obvious, and his star just immediately begins to rise. Potiphar no doubt thinks that he has picked up a bargain in Joseph. But you all probably know this part of the story. Potiphar's wife betrays Joseph. He's betrayed again. She accuses him of assault when he refuses her advances. So she sins against her husband. She sins against Joseph. She's a terrible woman. And because of her sinfulness and because of her betrayal, Joseph lands in prison. Can we agree this is not an upward trajectory for him? I mean, when you think, well, it can't get any worse than being sold into slavery, yeah, it can get worse. He winds up in prison. But as he arrives in prison, the same thing happens over again. Joseph just rises to the top, and soon he becomes a leader in the prison. He's interpreting the dreams of other inmates. He's making a huge difference in their lives. But once again, he's betrayed. He's just forgotten there in prison. Until one day, Pharaoh himself has a dream, and none of his advisors can interpret the dream. He hears about Joseph's ability to interpret, and so he sends for him. They clean Joseph up, bring him out of prison, and put him in Pharaoh's presence. Pharaoh tells him the dream. And with God's help, Joseph explains the dream. Here's what it is. Egypt is about to experience 7 years of great harvest. It's about to be wonderful. And then they're going to experience 7 years of famine. It's going to be terrible. As Pharaoh hears what Joseph says, he knows that he's right. In Genesis chapter 41, verse 38, then Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's Spirit in him? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as intelligent and wise as you are. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you. So 13 years after being sold into slavery, Joseph is moved from inmate to being second in command over the entire country of Egypt. He is 30 years old when he becomes what I would call the prime minister of the country. Now, can we all agree that's a ridiculously young age to have that much power? Who knew that the fast track to power was to spend 13 years in slavery and in prison? Who knew? Well, God knew. And what we find here is that God is at work through this whole time. Did God make the brothers throw him into a pit and sell him into slavery? No, he did not. That was them. That was up to them. Did God make Potiphar's wife lie about Joseph? Nope. That was her. That was all her. But was God working through every single bit of it? Yes. God kept working through all of it, and he has Joseph at just the right place, at just the right time, and Joseph doesn't disappoint. He becomes the second in command over all of Egypt, and he leads incredibly well. He predicted a bumper crop for 7 years. Sure enough, that's exactly what happened, and Joseph led beautifully throughout it. They had tremendous increase. They were prepared, and then guess what happens? They're hit with 7 years of famine. It's one thing to lead when times are easy. It's another to lead when times are hard. But in Genesis 41:55, when the whole land of Egypt was stricken with famine, the people cried out to Pharaoh for food. Pharaoh told all of Egypt, go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you. Joseph is in charge, and he doesn't lead just well through the good times. He leads well through the bad times also. And because of Joseph's leadership, Egypt becomes a destination for everybody from other countries around it to come and try to find food. This is a region-wide event, this famine. It's bad for a lot of people. Genesis 41:57 says, every land came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, for the famine was severe in every land. Now, who about this time is living in a country near Egypt? His family. Genesis 42, verse 1. When Jacob, Joseph's dad, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you keep looking at each other? Listen, he went on, I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we will live and not die. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he thought something might happen to him. If you look at Joseph, or Jacob rather, through that statement, do you see how betrayal has left a mark on him too? It wasn't just Joseph that was hurt by it. Jacob is incredibly wounded. He's still heartbroken over the loss of Joseph. And you can see it in the way that he talks to his sons. He treats them like bums. He basically says to them, boys, get up off the couch, quit playing video games, stop eating Cheetos, and go do something important for a change. He really comes down on them. Can you hear the bitterness and the way that Jacob addresses his sons? It's there. It's there. The brothers thought they would sell Joseph into slavery, and they would then in turn be better off. Were they right? Doesn't seem it. So the brothers head to Egypt to buy food. And who do you think they run into? Joseph. And just like Joseph's dream, his brothers bow down before him. Now, you all, this is where I love to insert myself into the Bible story. And I'm typically as the hero, not as the villain. It's just me. But when I insert myself into the story as Joseph here, you know what I'm saying to my brothers as they bow down before me? Nanner, nanner. Told you, right? That's where I would have gone. That's not what Joseph does at all, okay? He recognizes his brothers. Look at what it says in Genesis 42, verse 7. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. Now, if you know the overall arc of this story, you know that ultimately Joseph is going to go on to be reconciled with his brothers. And you look at that statement right there in verse 7. He treats them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. Does that sound like reconciliation to you? It doesn't. And so when you look at that, you're like, well, what is going on here? Is Joseph about to take them out? Is he going to, is this the end of the line for his brothers? No, that's not it at all. Joseph is going to test their character before he goes any further. And if you look at Genesis chapters 42 for the next and through 44, you're going to find that Joseph repeatedly tests their character and honesty. Years ago, President Ronald Reagan made this statement, "Trust but verify." Do y'all remember that little statement? That's exactly what Joseph is doing here. He's going to trust, but he's going to verify. He needs to know who his brothers are. See, Joseph has been changed for the better in response to the betrayal. But what about the brothers? He wants to know, are these the same men that sold me into slavery? Is that still where they're at? Is that still who they are? And so Joseph just puts them to test over and over and over again. I encourage you to go to Genesis 42 and beyond and read about all the way he tests his brothers. And the brothers, by the way, to their credit, they passed test after test after test after test. And finally, Joseph reveals himself to them. Look at chapter 45, verse 4. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near me." And they came near. "I am Joseph, your brother," he said, "the one you sold into Egypt." Do you imagine this is a stunned group of people right here? "And now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve your life. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." So let me ask you, is Joseph bitter? No, he's not. And as I see that, and I see he's not bitter here, I had to ask the question, well, why not? Right? These are the people that sold him into slavery. Why doesn't he not just take them out? He's got the power to do it, and nobody could have blamed him if he had. See, Joseph has learned something through this experience that you and I need to learn as well. And here it is. God is able to do new things in your life, even when you're going through unimaginable pain. Now think about that. God is able to do new things in your life, even when you're going through unimaginable pain. So when we're going through the pain, we've got a choice to make. We can allow the pain to make us bitter and vengeful and hateful, or we can allow God to shape our character by watching what he's doing through the pain that we're in. And that's what Joseph does. He does that second step. Instead of retaliating against his brothers, he cares for them. And at Joseph's invitation, the entire extended family moves into Egypt. They're welcomed by Pharaoh himself. They're settled in some beautiful land for all of their flocks. They grow, they prosper, and they become a true nation, just as God had promised Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. It happens. They grow into this nation. They're inside of the country of Egypt. God's plan for the nation of Israel ran right through Joseph's response to betrayal. And you all, this is huge because through the nation of Israel, God brings hope to every single one of us, does he not? Through who? Through Jesus. Do you see how Joseph is really at this kind of important inflection point in all of redemptive history? Do you see it? It's right there. And as I read Joseph's story, I'm thinking, how does he do that? Because as I've said, if I had been in his shoes and my brothers bowed before me after what they had done, I would have been like, man, off with their heads. I'm done with these guys. Get them out of my sight. So how does Joseph go from the person who was betrayed, all that pain and so forth, to being able to reconcile with his brothers the way that he does? Well, if you look at Joseph's story, you can kind of see that Joseph is working a formula. I was curious, what does he do? How is this something that I can do? Is this something I can replicate? Okay? So the first thing that Joseph does is he understands that God is working in the pit of betrayal. God was at work, even when things were going south. When Joseph's brothers threw him into the pit, God is waiting for him there at the bottom of the pit, right? He met him right there. And God was using the pit to prepare Joseph for a level of leadership that he absolutely could have never imagined. And he was working in Joseph's life when he was sold into slavery, and he was working in Joseph's life when he was sent off to prison. God was using all of it for Joseph's ultimate good. So in God's hands, all of that betrayal, it was more than just pain. It was preparation for what he had for him. King David was no stranger to betrayal either. He understood this. Look at what he says in Psalm 40, verse 2. He brought me up from a desolate pit, out of the muddy clay, and set my feet on a rock, making my steps secure. He lifted me out of the pit of despair, out of the mud and the mire. He set my feet on solid ground and steadied me as I walked along. See, both David and Joseph understood that God was with you, is with you in the pit. He works in spite of the betrayal, and he can set you on solid ground. Now take a moment and look at the pain of your own past. Just call up that tragic time. Is it possible that even when you were experiencing that pain, that God was at work the whole time? Maybe you come from a family and there's a legacy of betrayal in your family. Maybe a betrayal was kind of the defining moment in your life because someone close to you, someone that you trusted, absolutely sold you out and betrayed you. And that pain is great and it won't seem to go away. But I want you to understand, in that moment, God is at work even if you can't see how. Joseph understood this. And that's allowed him not to be defined by the pain, but to be prepared by it instead. Here's the second lesson that we see at work in his life. Because God is working, you can live in the present, not in the past. Knowing God was working in the pit of betrayal allowed Joseph to not just wallow in that pain, right? As he looked back at his pain, he was able to say, okay, God was working there and there and there and there. So he's able to move on and live his life in the present. He's not branded by the pain. Okay? He's been able to come free of that, and he's able to live a whole new life today. After Joseph becomes second in command, he has a family, and it's really cool. He names his kid two very interesting names. In Genesis 41, verse 51, Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh and said, God has made me forget all my hardship and my whole family. How many of y'all sometimes would like to forget your whole family? Anyway. And the second son he named Ephraim. And he said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Now, Tommy pointed this out last week, but look at the names of Joseph's two kids. The first one, he names Manasseh. It sounds like the Hebrew word for forget. Why would you name your kid forget? Well, he goes on and he gives us a reason. God has made me forget all my hardship and my whole family. Now, wait a minute. If I want to forget something, am I going to name my child Forget? Because then every time I say, hey, forget, come here, what am I going to do? Am I going to remember or am I going to forget? I'm going to remember. Every single time I call his name, I'm going to be reminded that I named him Forget for a reason. And there's something really healthy about what Joseph is doing here. Is he denying if you will, the trauma of his past? Is he denying it? No. He's not denying it. Every time he called his child Manasseh, hey, forget, come here. He's being reminded of that story. But is he being owned by that story? Is that what controls him? No. He's putting the pain in its proper place. So every time he sees his son, every time he calls his son's name, he's thinking, those were some tough days, Lord. Those were some tough days. But you were with me. You were working. So I'm going to forget the pain. I don't live in the pain. I live with the confidence that through that whole story, you were at work. You all, I've seen this in my own life. You all know my story. I've shared it with you all many times that both my mom and dad were gone by the time I was 13. And man, I got to tell you, my teenage years, those were some very painful years. It was just no fun at all. Every time I turned around, I was dealing with some of the fallout from that hardship. But as that time went by, I began to realize that God was at work the whole time, all through that very painful sequence. I began to realize that, you know what? God gave me amazing parents. My mom and dad were incredible people. They were very high achieving, both of them. They were very driven, both of them. They were very determined, both of them. They raised me to be incredibly independent. Both of them. When I was like 10 years old, my mom would take me to Kentucky Lake, drop me off, hand me the keys to a boat, and say, okay, I'll see you tomorrow. And I would go out to one of the islands, and I would camp on the island, and then I would fish all the next day, and then come back and meet my mom at the dock. I was 10 years old. Today, we would call DCF on a parent that does that, okay? But do you see how valuable that was? God was at work because, man, by the time I was 13, I was on my own. Did I need to understand a little bit about how to function independently? Absolutely. But let me just tell you, being a teenager and functioning independently, it is no fun. It's a very lonely way to live. When I became 19, God gave me a wife. I'd been 19, 11 days when I got married, right? I knew not one single thing about how to be a good husband or how to find a good wife. And yet God blessed me. And I have an amazing wife. And if you all know Pam, you know that she is absolutely lights out, right? I was able to look back and say, you know what? All through that terrible time, God was working faithfully to make a way for me. Now, let's go back to Joseph. He names his first son Manasseh, which means to forget. What about the second son? He names him Ephraim, which means fruitful. So every time Joseph called this son's name, he would remember where he was today. He was saying, by God's grace, each day is new. Each day is fruitful. My focus isn't on the past. It isn't what happened back then. It's on what God is doing right now. Years after Joseph was reunited with his brothers, their father Jacob dies of old age, and Joseph and his brothers take Jacob's body back to the land of Canaan where he wanted to be buried. So they go there for the funeral, and when the funeral is all said and done, they come back to Egypt, and you all can imagine in those days this would have been quite an undertaking, quite a long trip. They return to Egypt, and Joseph's brothers become afraid. They begin to wonder, you know what, now that Dad's out of the picture, if Joseph's going to do us in, this is when he's going to do it. And they began to be terrified that Joseph would take them out now that his dad was gone. So they sent Joseph a letter, and they said, hey man, tell you what, if you won't kill us, we'll become your slaves. How about that? You know, we sold you into slavery. You can put us into slavery. How about some payback? If that will keep us alive, let's go for it. Look at what Joseph says in his response in Genesis 50, verse 19. Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. Where was Joseph's focus? Was it on the past? Nope. Joseph's focus was on what God was doing right now. His focus was on the activity of God, not on the activity of his brothers. So he was able to say, hey, fellas, look at what God did. What you all did, yep, that was a terrible thing. But when you all were doing a terrible thing, you know what God was doing? He was working the whole time. And you know what I see right now? I see how fruitful God has made me. By his grace, I'm in this position, and I've been able to save many lives. Man. In the New Testament, we find the letter from James. It sheds light on the process that Joseph must have worked through. Look at James chapter 1, verse 2. Consider it great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials, because you know that that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. Look at the command there at the very beginning. Consider it what? Consider it great joy. When you experience what? various trials. That word consider, that's the imperative command in the sentence. James says, when you suffer, you must see it as joy, because in those trials, God is at work. And He's proving your faith, and He's bringing about endurance, which leads to maturity and completeness, lacking what? Lacking nothing. Did Joseph live out James's command? Absolutely, he did. Do you see how the trials that Joseph experienced at the hands of his brothers resulted in endurance? Do you see that? Yeah, that'll do it. That'll do it. Can you see how that endurance resulted in Joseph being mature, complete, and lacking nothing? Can you see it in his life? Absolutely. You know, I mentioned before about my mom and my dad. I've also told you all many times about the early days, I guess the first 10 years or so of my marriage with Pam. Pam and I, when we first got married, it was great. I mean, it was just a party. I'm 19 years old, and it was like getting the coolest roommate ever. We loved it. Our first years were awesome. And we had the typical debate. You all know the debate when you're newlyweds of do we have kids or do we not have kids? And we were, then we weren't, then we were, then we weren't, then we were, then we weren't. You all know. Finally, we decided we are. And here comes Jessie. What a great girl. What a beautiful baby. She was awesome. But we were in the midst, when Jessie was born, we were in the midst of working with the International Mission Board to go and live in Ethiopia. And we agreed that's change. That is dynamic change. And at just that moment, Pam's got Jessie. And moms, you know, that was not easy for her. At a time when she wanted to be investing and nesting and all of that stuff, we were uprooting and moving halfway around the world, literally. And you all, it just rocked our marriage. By the time we got to Ethiopia, we were hanging on by an absolute thread. And after a year or so in Ethiopia, I'll be candid with you. Man, I hated my wife. I'm not proud of that. I'm just being honest with you. That's how I felt. And I was literally just begging for a divorce. I wanted the pain to stop so much. I just felt like the girl that I married that was all smiles and so much fun had betrayed me. And she had become this mean-spirited person I didn't even recognize. Now, by the way, I'm telling you all this from my perspective. Pam would tell you you were no party either. But man, it was tough. It was tough. It took a long time for us to work through that. By God's grace, I'll be honest with you, I'm so glad that we lived halfway around the world where it was really hard to get a divorce, because it forced us to pump the brakes. And we made the decision that we were going to treat one another at least as well as we would treat the bag boy at the grocery store, a total stranger. And you all, that was a real improvement for us. And that opened the door ever so slightly for a step in the right direction. And God was working, you all, this whole time. The whole time. He was at work. And little by little, we began to get better and better and better. And I remember the day I was in the car and I was just driving along and I started thinking about my marriage. And it hit me that at that precise moment, my marriage was better than it had ever been. And I couldn't help but just sit there and just stop in the car. And God, you were working the whole time. You were working. Now, I'll be honest with you. I would not want to go through that season of pain ever, ever, ever again. But I also will tell you, I wouldn't trade it for the world. Because it's changed the way that I live every single day as a husband. It's changed the way that I look at my wonderful wife. And it's changed the way that I view my future with my wife. It's changed everything. Because I can see that how God was at work even through the pain. He was there. I didn't see it, but He was there and He was working. And He was making all things new. And that allowed me, when I realized that, it allowed me to live in the moment and to see that right now where I am, in spite of all that went on before, God is making it fruitful. And I can live in confidence because I know that even if we hit another hard time, just as God was faithful before, He'll be faithful then too. And my whole attitude about my present and my future is different. You don't have to be locked into the pain of your past. You don't have to. Because God is at work. And He makes it possible for you to live in the moment and expect a brighter day tomorrow. Let's just take a moment. Let's just pray together right now. God, thank you so very much for working even when we cannot see it. Thank you for being there when we are in the midst of terrible pain. We don't understand what's going on. It may be pain caused by the sin and evil of others, but you're still working. Help us not to forget that, Lord. And Father, help us to say, no, today, right now, you are making all things fruitful. And I can live in this moment because I know that you've been working in my past. Thank you, Father. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.